This week we're going to be talking about software testing, which is a little bit unusual inside of the requirements sphere that we're talking about, but there's some good justification for why it could be included. It's not necessarily typical, and I mean, honestly, if this was mine to control, I'd rather spend another week or two playing with requirements concepts, but the value I can certainly put on talking about the requirements into testing this early is the best way to check out did you write reasonable requirements is to test out can you make tests for them. We've talked about this a lot inside of the basics of what are requirements is are they testable? So when we talk about testable, well, what is testing? Let's come back around to that idea. Well, testing is the process that we're going to say that something meets the requirements, ironically enough. So the requirements help define what testing is, and then testing helps refine the requirements. It's kind of a cycle there. So if you're going to cook dinner, you take a sample of things as you're cooking it. If you buy some fancy clothes, they typically have a little number in the pocket, which was the inspector who made sure the clothes were good. If you're going to buy a car, you take it out, not any car, that specific car. You take it out for a test drive. It's nice to check out some other models, but sometimes you want to drive that specific car, particularly in used cars. So software is a little bit different. We don't have to worry about that sort of wear and tear like that. Once if you have one application, they're pretty much the same everywhere, pending configuration or hardware issues or things like that. So it's not too bad, but we do need to check that our software does what we expect it to, and that's where we tie back to the requirements. The requirements telling us what we expect it to do. So the different types of testing we're going to do helps determine the different is determined, by the different types of requirements that we write and what we're trying to figure out. So the first type of testing we can talk about is validation testing. And this is really the question, are we getting to the right answer? Your typical testing isn't, you don't run test cases to say this. This is something we need to do to validate, do we have the right requirements? So let me give you an example. So if you're going on a trip, it's not so much of how well did you follow the directions, did you turn left and right and drive the exact perfect amount of miles and go on each street, so much as did you pick the correct destination. When GPS receivers first came out years ago, I was going to visit my grandma. She was just put in a nursing home. I'd never been there before. I put in the address of the nursing home. I followed the directions perfectly and ended up across the street from the high school. Because the GPS receiver, when it didn't recognize the new street or the new nursing home that was just built, didn't know that, it took me to the city center. So I followed those directions perfectly and was about 5 miles away from where she was, and I had to basically come by and figure it out and make some phone calls. And this is before there was internet on the phone, so the GPS was a physical device. So it was a bit of a challenge, and I mean the irony is I would have been able to get there. Had I known where the address was, I'd have been able to get there without the GPS at all. I knew exactly it was right off of one big main street. So the point being was, I followed the directions perfectly. I followed the test case and I did everything the test case did, and I passed every test case. But I didn't have the right requirement to begin with. I didn't have the right building input that I was going to be going to. And that happens a lot. We talk about a system, we talk about the quality of the system, but we never talked about is that meeting the user's need. So that's something that has to happen on the requirements that you're writing. That's something you have to figure out. And that's where your modeling comes in. That's where your interviews come in. That's where you review the requirements there. That's where use cases become a really big helper because they really show what that user interaction would look like. So past that, we get into verification testing, which is what we just talked about. Can I follow directions? This is the test cases that says, hey, press this button, enter 72, press this other button, check if the answer is what we expect it to be. So it's not just about the code entirely being correct. It's about, did I have good requirements? Did I make them very testable? Was the design reasonable? Is the test case the proper test case? Is this really what I expected to have happen along those lines for all those things? Is the configuration set up? Is the network working? Is the database properly loaded with data? All those different things that could happen along the test cases. The verification is checking the whole system delivers as promised by the requirements. So within that, we have a couple different types of testing we can approach. There's what's called static testing, which is not code running. It's sitting around and looking at work products. It's reading the requirements and checking them out. It's looking at the design and seeing if that makes the sense. It can be code reviews, or it can even be test reviews to make sure the test cases make sense. And these are all the different viewpoints that we kind of judge. Do we think it's sort of kind of doing the right thing? So we can do that through reviews of looking at the document. We can do that through simulation. If we had a business process that we're talking about, we could fake that business process and then fake what the computer does along the way and see, does that help? Does that make my total answer the right thing? And this kind of happens through simulation, or one of the ways of doing that is role play, where humans do that simulation. Humans act out the computer bits and make those things happen. The other side is dynamic testing, which is what you typically would think of. Your system's live, you execute your code, and then there's all sorts of tiers and levels of that we can talk about. And you will talk about that stuff more as you get to a testing class later on, if you take that testing class. Here, we're mostly worried about the specific functional testing. We're going to be looking at test scripts and test cases and things like that. That's what we're going to focus on, because that is what helps us best understand our requirements. So reviews become that hidden but really important test cases, because testing is generally a reactive thing. I built this thing, does it work? Does it do the right thing? Is there tweaks of it? It doesn't necessarily get you to the, is this the right thing to do, which is why you have reviews of requirements, reviews of the design. If I review the design and say, hey, this is great that it has wheels, but my house is on the top of a hill and wheels aren't going to roll up the top of the hill. Maybe you need tank treads inside of there instead. That's a good thing to figure out, and suppose to making a vehicle with wheels and not being able to drive up the hill. That'd be expensive to retrofit it. That's where reviews can come in. And so we'll actually talk about reviews later on a little bit more, because they are super important, and the process by which they get done is really important too, because it's mostly a human process. It takes a lot of negotiation and back and forth. So the idea behind all this is that all of testing comes around to those requirements, that looking at the requirements and reviewing the requirements is good, and by writing test cases here and now, you're actually trying to put action to those requirements, because you're going to be using those requirements through multiple testing phases. We'll learn more about testing phases. Again, it's not the focus of this class per se, but just kind of giving you a heads up. There's unit testing, which happens on very small things. Sometimes requirements translate all the way down to the unit. If you say, I want to paint the house red, well, at some point, some person has to have red paint in a can, and they're going to put it onto the house or a bucket. And that filters all the way down from the high-level specification to the person doing the work. In other cases, there's things that happen, like setting up a ladder, which is not a requirement. You're not going to say, I'm going to write a contract to put ladders on my house. It's just, I want to write a contract to put paint on my house. And if it happens to be a ladder, fine. It could be scaffolding. It could be a lift. It could be an acrobatic team standing at each other's shoulders. It's okay. Whatever gets there, that's where the difference is in that level of unit testing. Is in unit testing, I would want to test out, hey, how's the ladder work? Is the ladder safe? Does it reach to the places it needs to reach to? Things like that. Integration testing, starting to put pieces together, put them all together, and start to get the system working. So again, we have scaffolding plus the paint sprayer. Now we put the two of them together. Can I put paint in a house? Again, I'm talking an analogy here. I mean, software is a little bit different, but I don't want to get lost in design details that aren't important right now. Functional testing is our requirements testing. That's the core of what we have happen. What we want is we want a red house, and so after they paint it, I look at the house. Is it red? Yes, great. Oh, they forgot to do the shutters. So now what do we do about that? Well, we write a defect and we have them go and fix it. Performance testing is about efficiency and things like that. That's our non-functional requirements that we wrote down. So it's pretty common. Not all of them gets done in performance testing, but all of the ones around, how quickly did they paint the house? How much of the extra paint was left over to clean up afterwards? That sort of performance things is what comes up. User acceptance testing is basically going to the homeowner and say, do you like the paint? So we built this whole thing in imagination when we set it up, and now that we actually have it here, is it good? And so in software, this is where I take my system, as it turns out, we hopefully got the requirements well. Sometimes really unit user acceptance testing is testing that validation of did I write the right requirements to begin with. Hopefully we did, but maybe we tweak some stuff. Like, oh, by the way, normally when I hit F7, it reorders the list to be alphabetically ordered. Oh, well, I didn't know that was a feature. We can add that back in. Do you need it right now, or can we do it with the next release? Next release is fine. So that's the type of thing you would expect to have happen in user acceptance testing. But sometimes user acceptance testing is very detailed. Sometimes they're going down to, hey, I have this test case, and then when I put in 7, it should have an answer of 14, but it comes up with an answer of 14.2. Yeah, very detailed type stuff could happen for very advanced users. Regression testing isn't really a type of testing. It's more of a strategy for any one of these types of testing. It means something changed. What do I really need to test when it's all said and done? And then product verification testing is after I deliver the software. Does it still work as it did in the test environment? Sometimes in production, when I go connect to eBay or PayPal or Amazon or whatever for real, maybe it behaves slightly differently because their environment works slightly differently. So the biggest thing here is there is no universal test plan. There's no universal test case. It's all based off of your project requirements. So even if you have, 2 of you are up, both doing airline reservation system. If you wrote the requirements slightly differently, you're going to have slightly different test cases. This is where the test cases fall back to the requirements. If I have a requirement that says my airline reservation system shall allow people to book multiple flights. Okay, well, does that mean at the same time? Where they pay all at the same time? Does it mean that they can do one the next day? It's not really clear. So what it could say is the airline reservation shall allow a person to add in multiple flights for multiple people or on multiple trips on multiple days and purchase them all together at once. So that would be a little bit more descriptive. And you might not, it might have sounded at first, book multiple flights. Oh, sure, that sounds great when you're doing the review. But when you write the test case, it's like, well, what does that look like? It's the question of, is it fast? Well, what is fast? It sounds fine. I want it to be fast. Yeah, we want it to be fast. Do you want it to be fast? Sure, we want it to be fast. Well, now go test it to find what fast is. Oh, well, fast should be instantaneous, right? Yeah, but that's not going to happen all the time. So what is fast? And that's performance requirements are easy to talk about, but it often happens in functional requirements as well. So that's what we're trying to talk about this week is we have to have a way of checking out our requirements. And use cases help us to make those requirements actionable, but even they allow us to defer some details. And so when we write test cases, particularly test cases with data involved, that's where we really start to see, is this a plausible scenario? Can I do a simulation where I have inputs and outputs, and does that make sense? If I can't calculate all the values I need by hand, perhaps it's going to be hard for my developers to figure out everything inside. They're going to be coming back to me and asking me, what is my requirement? What do I need to do this? Where do I get this thing from? Where do I get this data from? Does the user have it? Is it system loaded? That sort of thing can come out very easily by creating specific test cases. That's what we'll do through this week, and that's what I want you to focus on as we go forward.